The Hoffman Show. We're on the Team 980. We're always live as well on the free Odyssey app. Of course, you're home for Wizards basketball. Tonight, 6:45 pregame, 7 o'clock the tip time. But a new head coach. That's the story of the day. And joining us to talk about it is Ava Wallace of the Washington Post. And, you know, Ava, we did our usual game day routine yesterday. We had Dave Johnson on the show. Dave and I are yucking it up. It's a good time, as good as you can have in this kind of season. We're trying our best over here. And all of a sudden, in the middle of a back-to-back, I wake up this morning to Wes Unseld being relocated. Like, obviously, there's the record as to why this is happening. But can you give us some kind of greater context of, like, what it's been like with the Wizards this season and why you think now is the time that Will Dawkins and Michael Winger make this call?
Yeah, I do think the timing is the most interesting part of this. But as for the why, it does, in a way, make a little bit of sense to me, because talking to players this season, talking to assistant coaches, kind of everybody around the team, there are, and I know this is unbelievable because of the record and because of especially the way they were just getting absolutely hammered, particularly earlier in the season. And like even in those two games in Cleveland to start the year, the Wizards have not been competitive, which is odd because they have kind of been individually doing pretty well. Like you could go down the list, like Kyle Kuzma has been a much more consistent scorer this year. Corey Kispert is doing the right things even if they're not coming up on paper. Denny Avdia is notably better. Bilal Coulibaly is kind of better than expected. So it's kind of like, why isn't this working out on paper? And why can't we kind of put this together as a team? And the players themselves have kind of been wondering that. Just in conversations I've had with them in recent weeks, something that's come up is like, a lot of guys saying this is the best locker room they've ever been a part of and something that has the most chemistry. And so a lot of guys then say, you know, you look at teams across the league that have good chemistry and none of them are losing like we are. So something is wrong here. And to me, just looking at it, you know, the eye test, there's definitely a lack of accountability. There's a lack of accountability on defense. There are things like when players do things wrong in the game, they don't get yanked. They just stay on the floor. And some of that is roster construction. You know, Wes Unseld Jr. didn't have an abundance of defenders to work with, for example, but some of it was clearly like, okay, maybe this team needs a new voice or needs a new leader. Again, not saying the lack of competitiveness falls completely on Wes Unseld Jr.'s shoulder, but I do think the Wizards are kind of searching for an answer here.
No, without question. And I went back this morning and listened to my interviews, or at least parts of them, with Wes Unseld and Will Dawkins from the preseason. And there was a couple of clips I was trying to find. And the one that I was really trying to find out from Wes was I remember asking him, like, what's his definition of success? And I'm glad you used the word competitiveness because that's the word he used. And he's like, we have to be getting better and we have to compete. And I think you look at how many times they've been blown out this year and the number of gigantic leads that they have blown. And even if you know you're not going to win a ton of games and all of the structural challenges they face, I did start to wonder about a month ago, like kind of that Toronto game where they blew just I think that's the biggest one they've blown this year, certainly in the shortest amount of time, where I was like, I don't know if he's actually going to last the year. For you, was there any kind of turning point where you went from like, okay, this is part of this very painful and long process to like, there might be a change in this process?
Yeah, it's come very recently, honestly. I'm not going to pretend like there was a big sign that this change was coming. There weren't. I think a lot of people, I think most people were caught off guard, especially just with the timing of this. Like you said, the middle of a back-to-back, they kind of almost caught a break with the Bucks firing Adrian Griffin earlier this week. I wonder if some people think that this is a usual thing to fire coaches mid-season that are either in a rebuild season where winning supposedly doesn't matter or have a winning record like Griffin did. It is not. This is weird. It's just plainly weird timing. But just conversations kind of recently, and like you're in the locker room and you hear something like Kyle Kuzma said the other day where he said, you know, playing hard isn't always the answer. Playing harder isn't always the answer. I feel like we've had good energy. Maybe something else needs to change. So that's only recently. And I didn't follow up and say, are you talking about Wes Unseld Jr.? So that's me kind of interpreting there. But it's only recently that players have started really being like, we actually are improving and we actually are getting better. So you kind of start, you know, going down the list of like, okay, where are the problems here? Obviously, the roster is the biggest one. You need to have players who understand and want to play defense. But, you know, when you have your main player and Kyle Kuzma start talking about, you know, we haven't changed anything all year and maybe it's time to start making some changes, you start thinking like, oh, yeah, that's interesting. That I could see that.
Ava Wallace, Wizards beat reporter for the Washington Post, is with us. So let's unpack that a little bit more, because I do think like the last 2 weeks they've been a little bit more competitive. And part of that is like since the trade for Bagley, like part of their fundamental problem with the roster is, yes, they have bad defensive players all over the place, but they didn't have a second big. And when Gafford was hurt, or even when he was there, when he went out of the game, like they were screwed. Bagley comes in and some of the insanely bad stretches they would have where they just didn't have an answer go away. And as you said, it did feel like they were improving. So where's the disconnect where there is improvement, but it still feels like the right move when it's like, oh, because you can make an argument based off that, right? That, oh, things are changing. But why is that still then the right move? And kind of that other stuff you're hearing in the locker room where these two seemingly opposite narratives are happening at once?
Yeah, I think that's also a good kind of central question. And the thing that I kind of have landed on it in my mind and just talking to people this morning is that this is kind of the flexibility you're afforded when you're at square -1 of a rebuild. I think you could go two ways with this, honestly, where you say, okay, well, winning and losing weren't supposed to matter, so why all of a sudden do they matter? I don't think it's necessarily the record that has wrangled a lot of people, although that certainly plays a lot into this, definitely. But it's just the fact that, like you said, it's they're not competing. It's not games like last night that got Wes Unseld Jr. relocated, as you said, where they actually do pretty well against the Timberwolves, and it's like, okay, well, you're not going to overcome 21 turnovers. It's the fact that they were just getting blown out, and I don't know if it's necessarily. I do think what I went back to is like they don't have their big, strong number one guy. Like Kyle Kuzma is doing his best right now. He doesn't have a ton of help, but these players don't hold themselves or don't account for each other's weaknesses on defense the way that they can show they have on offense. That's something that's missing, where you're going to see individual growth and maybe guys not playing together as a team or understanding how to play team defense, coupled with the fact that like they're in a place in this organization's rebuild where they can say, hey, let's throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks. And I don't necessarily know if Michael Winger is being that casual about this, but I do think there's kind of that's kind of the methodology of this is working, this is working, this is working. Okay, so what haven't we tried yet? Maybe someone at the top needs to go. I think that's kind of what you're seeing here, and the flexibility they're being afforded in the status they are as an organization right now.
Ava Wallace, Washington Post, is with us. Okay, so a couple of other key things that I want to hit with you, as someone who knows his team inside and out like you do. First thing would be one last kind of roster adjacent thing, which is there's no question the biggest disappointment this year has been Jordan Poole. The hope was he would come here, he would turn around the just horrible year that he had on and off the floor last year in Golden State, gets flushed. He turns back into the guy that helped them win a championship in Golden State 2 years ago. That has obviously not happened. How big of a part of his lack of turnaround do you think leads to this decision today?
I don't know how much there's a one-to-one correlation, just because there are, I would say for certain, if you weren't seeing any growth kind of individually, like if those players I mentioned earlier, the Denny Avdias, the Corey Kisperts, Bilal Coulibaly, if they weren't seeing any progress, I think that would be a much easier thing to say of like, look, this isn't working at all and something needs to change. I do think Jordan Poole tends to be something of an anomaly, just because you remember where he came from, where he was raised, designed to do one thing in a system at Golden State, and he is struggling to do anything else in another system that isn't as specifically designed, where his role isn't as specifically defined as it was out there in the Bay. That's something that I don't know if is necessarily as intertwined with the team's issues as the rest of the things we've talked about are today. So yeah, that's what I would say about Poole. But certainly, I think you're right to say that like that is one of the things that has not gone right for the Wizards.
For sure. And like you said, they have done a tremendous job of obviously with Coulibaly and with Denny, and those guys have all made leaps. So it does seem to be a Poole specific thing. And I would say, and the last thing on Jordan real quick is coming into the year, I thought he was one of the most important pieces, because that's a guy that could, if he turns it around, net you 2 first-round picks in return, if not be a part of your future.
Sure.
Do they still see him as that, or is that like, I hate to do this because I don't want to commoditize a player and like do this haphazardly, but in the transactional nature of the NBA, is Jordan Poole essentially a sunk cost at this point for the Wizards, or does he immediately become a huge priority for Brian Keefe as the interim?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to categorize that. I would say the messaging that is coming out of the Wizards organization is that they certainly still believe in Jordan Poole, and they think he can get back to what he was in Golden State, a guy who can be an absolutely nightmare to try to defend and can really disrupt things. He obviously is not a natural born defender and has himself been working on that. So I don't know if they would categorize it as sunk cost. I think one way to measure that is, of course, people on the team, like when I hear something like, oh yeah, the Wizards still love Jordan Poole and people around the organization, everything, I understand that because he's a great guy to talk to. He works really hard.
Yeah.
His teammates seem to really like him. Like he's a part of that locker room in a successful way. You think, okay, do you believe in him? Or is it the fact that, nobody's going to want that contract either and the trade deadline's coming up. So this is kind of what's floating around in the air. So sunk cost, I don't know because it hasn't been that long, honestly. And he's clearly still working it out, coming over and having a big adjustment year. But that's something certainly that I think this new front office will absolutely be measured on, and partly because that was all part of the Bradley Beal, Chris Paul, whatever trade, like they are going to be judged on that, certainly. So I think it's a little bit too soon to give a definitive answer on that. Just, it's only been half a season. So right now, not good. I'd be interested to see if they can get some pieces around him to help him and make it work a little bit more. But yeah, right now, not a good situation.
Yeah, no, that is something that post-trade deadline, I do wonder if he, like right now, the priority is like, we got to keep Tyus out there because he's going to be flipped at the deadline. Let's maximize his value. And it's like, okay, second half of the season, when the guys that are going to get traded are gone, do you build a lineup that is more Poole friendly, if you will? That's something that we'll find out not too long from now. It's only a couple weeks away. Wrapping up with Ava Wallace here on The Hoffman Show, of course, the Wizards beat reporter for The Washington Post. Last thing, kind of with the current team, and then I want to ask you about Wes and kind of where he goes. But Brian Keefe is named the interim. He's got some OKC ties, because of course he does. What's the Brian Keefe story? And, they've already said, like, we're going to do an extensive search in the offseason, but why is he the right guy right now? And kind of what can you tell us about him?
I think there's a good baseline of trust built up. This was someone who came from the Spurs with Presti to start OKC. He was there in 2007, back when they were still Seattle, and kind of was one of the founding members of that organization over there. So Michael Winger first meets him in 2010, I believe, when he starts that job. So there's definitely a level of trust there. The second big part is the second half of this season there's going to be a really big focus on the Wizards' young players. They are not that young in NBA parlance, but pre-25-year-old players, I'll say. And Brian Keefe that's kind of his bread and butter. He worked with KD, James Harden. He worked with Russell Westbrook in OKC and has had a huge effect on those guys' careers, particularly Kevin Durant. He was with Kristaps Porzingis with the Knicks. He was with Shea for the second time around in OKC. Like, that's kind of what he does. He's been working with Coulibaly all season very closely, just with practice at him every day. So I can see if that's the direction they want to take this team for the second half of the season, why Brian Keefe would be the right choice. But they also believe in him as a schematic guy. So it certainly makes sense. And he was brought in just this summer coming over from the Brooklyn Nets, and players seem to like him. So, seems like a natural fit.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And then last but not least, like, Wes gets relocated to this front office role. What's that mean, Ava?
Yeah, front office advisory role, very specifically. So that there's a lot of flexibility in that advisory term. That is different from signing on for a role in the front office where you have a title and a contract and a job. That is a very flexible, nebulous thing that I think Winger and Dawkins really genuinely enjoy working with Wes Unseld Jr. It's not hard to see why. He's a lovely person, stand-up guy, and he is just an X's and O's, no pun intended, wizard, but he's a really good basketball mind. So I could see why they would want to keep him around. Also a pretty good time to keep ties with the Unseld family at this moment when Monumental Sports and Entertainment is not super, super high in the court of public opinion. That would be a pretty tough look, I think, right now with the arena move and everything, and some factions of the community mad about that. So I do think it works on both sides. I do not think this means Wes Unseld Jr. will never take a coaching or a head coaching job again. I think, again, the flexibility in that role really allows him to say, yeah, sure, I'll stick around, work in the front office. Maybe I fall in love with it. Maybe I will go take the first head coaching job for whoever calls.
Yeah, no doubt. And they picked up that option, as you reported, back in October. So he's on the payroll, so might as well get something out of sending him a paycheck. Ava Wallace, you can read her coverage of all of that, and you'll hear her asking questions of Michael Winger and Will Dawkins in the press conference coming up at 5 o'clock. Read her work in the Washington Post, WashingtonPost.com/sports. Ava, thank you as always on a very busy day for your time.
Thanks so much.
All right, we'll continue talking about all of this next on The Hoffman Show.
What's up, kiddos? It's your boy Clinton Yates from ESPN. It's The Hoffman Show on the Team 980. Tell your mama I said what's up.